My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 34 years old, and last Sunday night, my father gave me two choices over roast chicken and mashed potatoes. Pay my sisters $280,000 in debt, or stop calling myself his daughter. He said it the way he said everything important calmly, with both hands flat on the table, like he was settling an invoice instead of detonating my life. Outside, rain tapped against the kitchen windows in soft, steady clicks. The old clock above the refrigerator ticked loud enough to feel cruel. My mother sat across from me with her napkin folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a water ring near her plate, as if staring hard enough might open a hole she could disappear into. Lila wasn't there. Of course she wasn't. My younger sister had always had a gift for vanishing just before consequences arrived. I looked from my father to my mother and back again, waiting for one of them to blink, to soften, to laugh, and tell me this was some grotesque misunderstanding. But my father's expression never changed. "Say something," he said. I almost did. I almost asked the obvious questions. What debt? How did it get that high? Why on earth would you think I could pay that? But the truth was, the number itself wasn't what knocked the air out of me. It was the certainty in his voice. He hadn't said around 200,000. He hadn't said maybe closer to 3. He said $280,000 with the precision of a man who had looked at that number more than once. A man who knew it intimately. I set my fork down beside my plate. I hadn't taken a bite. "Why would I pay Lila's debt?" I asked. "Because she's your sister," my father said. That answer came too fast, too polished. He'd rehearsed this. I could hear it now, all the places he'd already said these words in his head before I ever walked through the front door. "She can't handle this kind of pressure," he added. "You can." There it was, the sentence buried under every family rule I'd grown up with. Lila gets protection. Naomi gets burden. Lila gets rescued. Naomi gets tested. My whole life had been built around that unspoken division, so familiar I used to mistake it for love. My mother finally moved, just barely. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her napkin. "Frank," she murmured, but it wasn't a protest. It was the weak little sound people make when they want credit for discomfort without risking disobedience. I turned to her. "Mom?" She still wouldn't meet my eyes. That hurt more than his demand. My father had always been hard, but my mother specialized in softer betrayals. She could wrap cowardice in concern, so neatly it almost looked maternal. My father leaned back in his chair. "You've done well for yourself," he said. "You've got savings, no husband, no kids. You're in a better position than anyone else." I actually laughed once. A short, broken sound that didn't feel like mine. 3 weeks earlier, my mortgage application had been denied on a house I'd spent 7 years saving for. A little blue house outside Cincinnati with a maple tree in the yard, and a back porch just big enough for a morning chair and a pot of herbs. I hadn't told them how much that denial had shaken me. I hadn't told them I'd lain awake 2 nights, wondering what serious discrepancies in my credit file could possibly mean. I hadn't told them because I still believed some parts of my life were mine to carry privately. Now my father was sitting at the head of the table, calmly volunteering my future like it belonged to him. "So that's it?" I asked. "You're not asking me. You're telling me. I'm telling you what family does for family." The rain kept tapping the windows. Somewhere downstairs, the pipes groaned in the walls. My mother lowered her head even further, and in that moment I understood something cold and final. Whatever this was, it had started long before tonight. I pushed my chair back and stood. My father's jaw tightened. "Sit down, Naomi." I picked up my keys from the table. My hand was steady, which surprised me. "No," I said. His face darkened. "If you walk out on this family over money, don't bother coming back." I looked at him for one long second, then at my mother, who still wouldn't look at me, and something inside me, some old obedient part, finally snapped clean in two. "If that's the price of being your daughter," I said, "then I'm not paying it." Then I walked out into the rain. I drove back to Cincinnati with rain blurring the highway lights into long yellow streaks, my father's words still hitting me in waves every few miles. Pay your sister's debt, or stop calling yourself his daughter. The sentence should have sounded cruel in a dramatic, unbelievable way. It didn't. That was the part that stayed with me. In my family, cruelty rarely arrived screaming. It usually came dressed as duty. By the time I got to my apartment, it was a little after 10. I let myself in, dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, and stood there in the dark without turning on the lights. My coat was damp. My hair still smelled like rain. For a moment, all I could hear was the hum of the refrigerator and the blood pounding behind my ears. I should have felt shocked. Instead, I felt something more familiar than shock. Recognition. Because Sunday night hadn't come out of nowhere. It only felt sudden because I had spent most of my life translating my family into kinder language than they had ever earned. Growing up, there were always two versions of love in our house. Lila got the soft kind. I got the useful kind. When she forgot a school assignment, my mother drove it over for her. When I forgot one, my father told me embarrassment built character. When Lila scraped the side of her car at 19, he called it bad luck and paid for the repair. When my transmission gave out in college, he told me I was smart enough to figure it out. So I did. I waitressed on weekends, picked up extra shifts during the summer, bought used textbooks, and learned very early that in our family, being dependable was just another way of being left alone. Lila was always treated like someone life happened to. I was treated like someone who could absorb impact. That difference followed us into adulthood so naturally nobody even bothered pretending otherwise. I built my life the slow way carefully, paycheck by paycheck, with a discipline so constant it stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like identity. By 34, I had a steady job in compliance auditing, a decent apartment, savings, and the kind of credit history that should have made buying my first home simple. Lila, meanwhile, kept being handed fresh starts. There was cosmetology school, which she left before the first year was over. Then a boutique that was supposed to be her real future, the business that would finally prove everyone wrong. My father helped with startup money. My mother defended every setback. Every failure came with a new explanation, a new cushion, a new rescue, and every rescue was framed as love. For years, I told myself I didn't resent it, that I was above that kind of bitterness. The truth was simpler and uglier. I had gotten too good at making peace with unfairness. It made life easier for everyone else. I was the daughter who drove home when my father needed help sorting receipts before tax season. The one who explained refinancing terms to my mother at the kitchen table while Lila said money talk made her anxious. The one who remembered birthdays, mailed thank you notes, never asked for much, and never let anyone see how tired I was getting. That role hardens around you slowly. One day you realize the family doesn't see you as a person with limits. They see you as the person who will handle it. I switched on the kitchen light and set my purse on the counter. My laptop sat on the table where I'd left it that morning, closed and harmless looking. The apartment around me was full of small evidence of the life I'd built by myself: matched dishes from a clearance sale, a secondhand bookshelf, neat stacks of unopened mail, a folder with mortgage documents I had been almost afraid to believe in. And that was when the memory came back sharp. 3 weeks earlier, the bank had denied my mortgage application for the blue house I wanted in Oakley. The loan officer had sounded polite, almost apologetic, when she mentioned serious discrepancies in my credit file and suggested I review everything before reapplying. I had told myself it was probably an error, a reporting mistake, a clerical mess that could be cleaned up with a phone call and a little patience. But now, my father's voice kept replaying in my head, especially the number. Not around 300,000. Not almost 300. $280,000. Exact, confident, immediate. He knew that number too well. I pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, staring at my laptop for a long moment before I opened it. For the first time in my life, I let myself consider something I had spent years refusing to believe. Maybe whatever was wrong hadn't started somewhere out in the world. Maybe it had started at home. That thought sat inside me for a few long seconds before my hands finally moved. I opened my laptop, went to the first credit bureau site I could think of, and signed in with the kind of concentration people use when they already know something is wrong, but haven't yet seen how bad it is. A verification code flashed on my phone. I typed it in. Then I waited, while the page loaded, the blue progress bar inching forward, like it had no understanding of urgency at all. When my credit score appeared, I stopped breathing for a second. 501. I stared at it, certain I had clicked into the wrong account somehow. 501. My score had always been solid. I paid my bills early, kept my balances low, and treated debt the way some people treat open flames, with distance and respect. A score like that didn't happen by accident. Not to me. I clicked into the full report. The first account was a credit card from a bank I had never used, opened more than 2 years earlier, with a balance just over $14,000 and several missed payments. Then another card, then a third, then a fourth. I kept scrolling, each line colder than the one before it. A personal loan for $62,000, another for $79,000, an auto loan for $38,400. A retail furnishing account with a balance big enough to outfit an entire apartment. None of it belonged to me. I got up, opened the junk drawer, and grabbed a pen. The only paper within reach was the back of a grocery store flyer, so I started writing the numbers down there, adding them myself because my brain refused to accept them as real while they lived only on a screen. 14,000, 11, 17, 62, 79, 38, 19. When I reached the total, I added it again. $286,400. I set the pen down and pressed my palm against the table. Outside, tires hissed over the wet street below. Somewhere in the building, a television audience laughed at a joke I couldn't hear. The apartment around me looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier, same dishes in the drying rack, same lamp by the couch, same unopened mail on the counter, but nothing in it felt familiar anymore. I had spent years building a life that was neat, documented, and careful. And somehow, underneath all of it, someone had been digging. I forced myself to keep reading. Every account carried my full legal name, my social security number, but the addresses attached to them weren't mine. Not my apartment in Cincinnati. Not any address I had used since college. 2 accounts listed my parents' old business address. The others were tied to a P.O. box in Lexington. I went very still. Then I pulled reports from the other 2 bureaus. The dates shifted a little. A balance here was slightly different there, but the pattern didn't change. The same accounts, the same debt, the same damage. By the time I finished, my kitchen table was covered in handwritten totals, screenshots, and notes written too hard and too fast. That was the moment disbelief gave out. This wasn't an error. It wasn't a bank glitch or a clerical mistake buried somewhere in a processing system. Someone had done this deliberately, over time, carefully enough that I hadn't seen it until it was already wrapped around my life. I went back to the auto loan and opened the details. The lender had included part of the vehicle information. Audi Q5. Black. Financed 20 months ago. I felt something tighten hard in my chest. Lila drove a black SUV. I had seen it before, once at Thanksgiving, once outside my parents' house in the spring. I remembered noticing that it looked too expensive for the version of her life she always described to me. But Lila was never short on explanations. A good month at the boutique, a lucky deal, a friend helping her out. In my family, suspicious things were always explained just quickly enough to keep anyone from asking a second question. I looked again at the address attached to the car loan. Dayton. Lila's apartment was in Dayton. The chair scraped against the floor when I leaned back. For the first time that night, the fear inside me changed shape. It stopped being the helpless kind. It turned into something sharper. I thought about my father sitting at the head of the table, saying the number without hesitation. I thought about the mortgage denial, the P.O. box, the way my mother had stared at the table instead of my face. One thing by itself might have been strange. All of it together was a design. My father hadn't known that number because he had heard about it. He had known it because he had been living inside it for a long time. And whatever had happened in that house on Sunday night, it was no longer about family pressure or my sister making bad decisions. It was bigger than favoritism, bigger than manipulation, bigger than one desperate demand at a dinner table. It was theft. Once that word settled into place, I stopped looking at the accounts as scattered damage and started looking at them the way I looked at any file that didn't make sense at work, line by line, date by date, until the pattern gave itself up. I didn't sleep. I pulled all 3 reports again and went through them more slowly this time, tracking balances, opening dates, payment history, mailing addresses, inquiry records. Then I opened a spreadsheet, because that was what I did when something was too large to hold in my head all at once. Rows, columns, notes, dates in order. I built a timeline while the apartment sat quiet around me, and the clock on the microwave crept past 1 in the morning. The first fraudulent account had been opened just over 2 years earlier. 1 month after I moved from Lexington to Cincinnati, I stopped typing and stared at that date. While I had been unpacking boxes in this apartment and learning the drive to my new office, someone back home had opened the first account in my name. Not years earlier, when I still lived under my parents' roof. Not during college. After I had already left. After I had become fully, legally, financially separate. That mattered. It meant this hadn't come from carelessness or old family access that had never been cut off. It had started after I left, which meant whoever did it made an active choice to begin then. I kept going. The statements hadn't been mailed to my apartment. Neither had the late notices. Every address attached to the accounts led back toward Lexington, either my parents' old business address or the P.O. box. Whoever set this up had not only opened accounts in my name, they had made sure I stayed blind long enough for the debt to grow teeth. At 2:03 inches the morning, I called Elena. She answered on the 3rd ring, thick with sleep at first, then instantly alert when she heard my voice. I walked her through everything as clearly as I could. The dinner, my father's ultimatum, the total debt, the auto loan, the P.O. box, the dates. I expected a pause when I finished, maybe a careful question or two. Instead, she said, "You need a lawyer before you need a family conversation." I leaned back in my chair and shut my eyes for a second. That bad? Yes. Her voice was steady now, working voice. And Naomi, listen to me. Don't call your parents. Don't text Lila. Don't give anyone time to clean this up or explain it away. Save everything. That landed because Elena wasn't dramatic by nature. She worked financial investigations. She spent her days untangling lies people thought would survive paperwork. If she was talking to me like this, then whatever I had found was already far past misunderstanding. "There's someone I want you to contact," she said. "Marcus Hale. He's in Columbus. He handles fraud and identity theft cases, including family cases. I worked with him last year. He's careful, and he knows how to build a record before people start panicking." A family case. I hadn't called it that yet. I had called it theft because that felt cleaner, easier to hold. But Elena's phrasing made the uglier part impossible to avoid. This wasn't just financial fraud. This was my own family turning my name into a resource. She sent me Marcus's number before we hung up. At 2:19 m. I emailed him everything I had. Screenshots from all 3 credit reports, the bank's mortgage denial notice, the running total, the loan details tied to Dayton, and a short summary of what my father had said at dinner. I wrote it the only way I knew how: plain, chronological, stripped of emotion. Dates, numbers, names, no adjectives I couldn't prove. Then I sat at the kitchen table and waited for morning. Marcus replied at 7:24. His message was brief and direct. "Miss Carter, I reviewed the documents you sent. This appears consistent with identity theft and fraudulent financial applications, with possible evidence of diverted mail. Do not contact the parties involved further until we speak. Can you be in my office at 1:00 p.m.? By noon. I was driving to Columbus with a folder of printed documents on the passenger seat and coffee going cold in the cup holder. The sky was clear, the roads were dry, and none of it reached me. Marcus Hale's office was on the 4th floor of a brick building a couple of blocks from the courthouse. His receptionist brought me into a conference room where he already had my email printed and arranged in separate stacks. He looked to be in his early 40s, sharp suit, controlled expression, the kind of man who didn't waste movement. He didn't begin with reassurance. He began with, "Tell me exactly what your father said." So I did. When I finished, Marcus glanced at the reports, then tapped the P.O. box listing with his pen. "All right," he said. "First, you are not paying this. Second, if the mail was redirected without your authorization, this may go beyond credit fraud. Third, from this point on, you stop approaching this as a daughter." He looked up at me then. "You approach it as the victim of a financial crime." I didn't answer him right away. The phrase victim of a financial crime stayed in the room for a second, stripped of every softer word I had been using in my head since the night before. Until then, some part of me had still been trying to force this into a shape I could survive as a daughter. A terrible family betrayal. A desperate act. Something ugly, but still, somehow inside the boundaries of blood. Marcus had just moved it out of that space entirely. He looked down at the reports again. "Walk me through the dinner one more time," he said. "Only what was said." So I did. I told him about the roast chicken going cold on the table, my mother staring at her napkin, my father saying Lila owed $280,000 and that I was going to pay it. Then the ultimatum: pay it or don't come back as his daughter. Marcus listened without interrupting. When I finished, he tapped one of the printed reports with his pen. "What's the total debt showing under your name?" 280, 6,400. "And what number did your father give you?" 280,000. He nodded once. "That's not a guess." I felt my jaw tighten. Up until that moment, I had still been holding on to the version of events that hurt less, the version where my father had found out Lila was drowning and decided I was the nearest life raft. Cruel, unfair, manipulative. Yes, but still reactive, still chaotic, still something happening in real time. Marcus set that version aside like it had no value. "If these debts existed under your sister's name," he said, "he would have asked you to help her. Pressure you maybe. Guilt you, probably. But that's not what happened. He gave you a number that almost matches the debt already sitting under your identity, then tied it to a moral consequence if you refused. That tells me he already knew where this debt lived." I looked down at the paperwork spread across the table. Not help her. Pay it. Not we need to figure this out. You're paying it. The difference felt obvious now. Almost humiliatingly obvious. My father had not called me to Lexington because Lila needed saving. He had called me there because discovery was getting close, and he needed me to cooperate before I understood what I was looking at. He wanted me to start covering it, I said quietly. "Yes," Marcus said. "And once you did, it would have been harder to separate your actual choices from the fraud." That sent a chill through me. Not because I had been about to say yes, I hadn't, but because I knew, with a kind of sick clarity, that for one stunned second at that table, my mind had still moved in the old direction. Not outrage, not suspicion. Logistics. How much? From which account? What can be delayed? What gets sacrificed first? That instinct did not come from nowhere. It had been built into me, over years. My family had trained me to respond to disaster by absorbing it. Marcus studied me for a moment, then slid another sheet toward himself. "Tell me about the mortgage denial." I gave him the short version. The house in Oakley. The polite call from the bank. The warning about serious issues in my credit file. How I had assumed it was some bureaucratic mistake because the truth had seemed too extreme to name. That may be why your father pushed when he did, Marcus said. If the credit damage had already started affecting a mortgage application, he may have realized you were close to seeing it for yourself. I sat very still. The meeting in my parents' kitchen rearranged itself again in my mind. Not a plea. Not panic. Not even punishment, exactly. It was pressure applied at the last possible moment, while he still thought guilt might work faster than facts. He hadn't sat me down to tell me the truth, he had sat me down to get in front of it. I lowered my eyes to the reports, then to my hands in my lap. They were folded tightly enough for my knuckles to show pale. For most of my life, my father had relied on the same version of me, the reliable daughter, the one who didn't make scenes, the one who solved what other people broke and called it love. Sitting there in that conference room, I understood that he had built his entire approach around that girl showing up one more time, but she hadn't. When I looked back at Marcus, something in me felt colder than fear and steadier than anger. So, I said, and this time my voice didn't shake at all, what do I do next? Marcus didn't answer right away. He took out a yellow legal pad, wrote 3 short lines in block letters, and turned it toward me. Document. Freeze. Don't warn them. That's where we start, he said. I looked at the page, then back at him. 3 steps. That was all. My whole life had just tipped sideways, and somehow the first response to it fit on a single sheet of paper. Marcus tapped the first word with his pen. Right now, your job is not to confront anyone. It's to preserve what already exists. Reports, screenshots, emails, texts, voicemails. Anything with dates, amounts, addresses, or statements that matter. Save everything in more than one place. I already have screenshots of the reports, I said. Good, keep going. He tapped the second word. Next, we freeze your credit with all 3 bureaus today. Not tonight, not after you've had time to think about it. Today. I nodded. And the last one matters just as much, he said. Do not give them a heads up. No calls. No emotional texts. No asking for explanations. Once people realize they're exposed, they start coordinating. Sometimes they start deleting. That was not the first time I'd heard that advice. Elena had said almost the same thing a few hours earlier. But coming from Marcus, in this office, with my reports spread across the table between us, it no longer sounded like a precaution. It sounded like procedure. What about Lila? I asked. If that Audi is tied to the loan, it will still be tied to the loan tomorrow, he said. The paper trail comes first. I knew he was right. I also knew how quickly my sister could turn any confrontation into something foggy and exhausting. Lila never argued like my father. She rarely pushed straight at you. She made you feel mean for noticing things. Suspicious for asking. Unfair for remembering. Marcus opened one of the reports again and marked the P.O. box listing with his pen. This may end up mattering as much as the debt itself, he said. If statements and notices were redirected there without your authorization, that tells us this wasn't only about opening accounts, it was also about keeping you from finding them. I stared at the address. I want you to think carefully, he continued. Have you ever signed anything that gave someone in your family permission to receive financial mail for you? Anything broad? Anything casual? Anything you didn't think twice about at the time? I don't think so. He gave a small shake of his head. Don't go by instinct. Go by records. Check old files, tax folders, banking paperwork, anything your mother may have asked you to sign. The way he said my mother, not your parents, not someone in the household, made me look up, he noticed. I'm not making conclusions yet, he said. But surprise has a way of showing on people. You told me your father was forceful. You told me your sister benefits from the car. But your mother sat through that conversation and didn't seem shocked. That may mean nothing. Or it may mean she knew more than she let on. That landed harder than I expected. My father was easy to picture as the one behind something like this. He believed in pressure, in leverage, in deciding what other people owed him. Lila was easy too, in a different way. She had spent years living like consequences, were things other people handled on her behalf. My mother was harder. Not because she was better. Because she was quieter. Marcus kept talking, moving us back into what could actually be done. He wanted a full timeline. The month I moved from Lexington to Cincinnati, the mortgage denial, every date tied to the fraudulent accounts, every time I had seen Lila with the Audi, every financial irregularity that had seemed strange only in hindsight. "We need something solid enough that it doesn't move when your family starts talking," he said. That I understood immediately. Family arguments change shape depending on who was speaking loudest. Facts didn't. Dates didn't. A credit inquiry either happened or it didn't. A mailing address either matched mine or it didn't. For the first time since Sunday night, I felt the panic in me narrow into something more useful. Before I left, Marcus walked me through the rest of it. Fraud alerts, password changes, banking logins, backups, what to touch now and what to leave alone until we had more. I wrote everything down. When the meeting ended, I stood and gathered the folder he had given me. It felt heavier than paper should have. At the door, Marcus said, "One more thing." I turned back. "Don't underestimate the quiet one." I held his gaze for a second, then nodded. By the time I reached the street, I was no longer thinking only about my father as the architect, or Lila as the one cashing in. I was thinking about my mother at that dinner table, looking down at her napkin, saying almost nothing, and never once looking surprised. For the first time, I let myself consider that her silence might not have been fear. It might have been participation. That thought followed me all the way back to Cincinnati. By the time I got home, it was late afternoon. The light in my apartment had gone pale, the kind that made everything look quieter than it really was. I set Marcus's folder on the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and started working through the list he had given me. Credit freeze first, then passwords, then my main email account. After that, I opened a new document and typed one word at the top in capital letters. Timeline. I started with the dates I knew for certain. Move from Lexington to Cincinnati. First fraudulent account opened 1 month later. Mortgage denial. Sunday dinner. I was kneeling by the hall closet, pulling out an old storage box full of tax folders and bank envelopes, when my phone started vibrating on the table. Dad. I stood still for a second, one hand on the edge of the closet door. Marcus had told me not to reach out. I hadn't. But ignoring the call didn't feel smarter than answering it. If my father was nervous enough to call, I wanted to hear what that sounded like, so I picked up. "Your mother cried all night," he said. No greeting, no attempt to ease into it. Just blame, dropped into the room like that, explained everything. I closed the closet door with my foot and leaned against the wall. "You gave me a demand, not a conversation." "That's not what happened. It is from where I'm standing." There was a short pause. In the background, I heard the soft ding of the store door and the distant beep of the register. He was downstairs at the business, taking this call in the middle of his workday, as if this were something he could slot between customers. "Lila is in serious trouble," he said. "This is not the time for you to make things worse." My grip tightened on the phone. By asking questions? By being emotional? I let out a breath through my nose. "Is that what this is?" His voice flattened. "Family takes care of family, Naomi." There it was, the sentence he always used when he wanted obedience to sound like character. I kept my tone level. Family doesn't use each other's names like backup credit. Silence. Not long. Barely a beat. But enough. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "Watch what you're implying." That was as close to panic as my father ever got. "You knew that number too fast," I said. "No one guesses that cleanly. We were going to take care of it." The words landed hard. Not because they were a full confession. They weren't. But they weren't denial either. They were the kind of answer people gave when innocence was already off the table, and all that remained was control. I stared at the wall in front of me. "You mean before I found it?" His reply came sharp. "If you do something reckless now, you'll tear this family apart." For a moment, I almost admired the precision of it. He had opened accounts under my name, let the debt build, called me home to pressure me into absorbing it, and now he was already setting the stage for me to become the one who ruined everything. "You should call your mother," he said. Then he hung up. I stayed where I was for a few seconds, phone still in my hand, heart beating hard but clean. Marcus had been right. My father did not sound blindsided. He sounded irritated that events had moved outside his control. 2 hours later, my mother called. The second I answered, I heard her crying, "Naomi, sweetheart, did you ever sign anything in my name?" Her crying caught in her throat, not stopped, shifted. "Your father was trying to hold everything together," she said. "That isn't what I asked." She took a shaky breath. Lila was in trouble. The store was struggling. It was all happening at once. I said nothing. People fill silence when they need relief from it. My mother always had. "He said it would only be temporary," she whispered. I felt my mouth go dry. "Mom, did you sign my name?" This time the silence was longer. I could hear her breathing, uneven and shallow, and underneath that, the sound of someone trying to decide which version of herself she was about to become. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone thin. I did what I thought I had to do. I closed my eyes. There it was. Not shock, not confusion, not even a real attempt to hide it anymore. Just guilt, dressed up as sacrifice. A second later, she said, almost in a whisper, "If you go to the police, you'll destroy this family." I looked at the open timeline on my laptop. The cursor blinked under Sunday dinner, waiting. "No," I said. "I'm just done pretending this didn't happen." She started crying harder after that, but the sound had changed. It no longer felt like grief. It felt like fear. When the call ended, I walked back to the table and added 2 new lines beneath the last entry. Father did not deny prior knowledge. Mother admitted signing my name. Then I saved the document, backed it up, and kept going. By 9 that night, my apartment looked more like an office than a home. Marcus's folder was open beside my laptop. Tax files, old bank statements, insurance papers, lease documents, and half-forgotten envelopes were spread across the table in loose stacks. I had already frozen my credit, changed my passwords, and backed up the timeline, but I still felt like I was only one layer into this. I opened an old accordion file next, the one I had dragged through 2 moves without thinking much about it. W2S, health insurance notices, car registration renewals, a lease from my first apartment in Cincinnati. Then, halfway through a pile of miscellaneous paperwork, I found a 1-page authorization form with my signature at the bottom. It took me a second to place it, then I remembered. About 2 years earlier, before a work conference in Chicago, my mother had asked me to sign it in case a package showed up while I was gone. She said she didn't want it returned or left sitting somewhere. At the time, it had sounded harmless, the kind of small favor families ask for without making it feel important. I sat down and looked at the page again. My full legal signature ran across the bottom in blue ink. Clean. Familiar. The same version of my name I used on leases, banking forms, and tax documents. I reached for one of the copied application pages from the fraudulent accounts and set them side by side. At first glance, they looked close enough to make my stomach tighten, but the longer I stared, the more the differences showed. My signature moved more naturally across the line. The spacing was looser. On the forged copies, the letters sat too close together, as if someone had studied the shape without fully catching the rhythm. It was not enough to stand out to a stranger, but it was enough for me. That form had not given anyone permission to borrow money in my name. What it had done was give whoever forged those applications a clean sample to work from. I photographed both pages side by side, uploaded the images into the evidence folder Marcus had told me to build, and sent him a short email with the subject line, "Possible signature reference." He wrote back about 20 minutes later, "Good find. Preserve the original, and don't write on it. We'll compare it to the application copies tomorrow." That helped. There was a process now. Not just panic and discovery, but sequence. I turned back to the auto loan. Using the account details already tied to my identity in the credit file, I pulled up what I could from the lender records. There wasn't much, but there was enough. Vehicle type, color, origination date, partial VIN, and an address in Dayton tied to the registration and delivery file. I already knew whose address that was before I saw it. Lila's. I felt that cold, sinking clarity move through me again. The black Audi had not been some lucky upgrade or short-term lease or one of Lila's vague, cheerful explanations that never held still long enough to question. It had been attached to a loan in my name all along. I could picture the car perfectly now. Clean paint, silver trim, always parked like it belonged exactly where it was. I thought about Thanksgiving, the way Lila had come in tossing her keys onto the counter, laughing when I asked if business had finally picked up. Lucky month, she'd said. Lucky. I went one step further and accessed the insurance information linked to the vehicle through the account records associated with my identity. Policyholder, Naomi Carter. My social security number was attached to the policy. The mailing address on file was the Lexington P.O. Box. I sat back slowly. At that point, it no longer felt possible to treat Lila as someone standing near the edge of this. She was using the car. The policy sat under my name. The paperwork bent back to the same P.O. box my mother and father were now pretending not to understand. However they had justified it to themselves, this was not something happening around my sister. It was something benefiting her directly. A few minutes later, Marcus called. I saw your email, he said. That signature form matters. So does the Audi, I said. The insurance is under my name too. My number, the P.O. box, the Dayton address, everything links back. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had that steady tone I was beginning to trust. That's good, he said. It gives us more than suspicion. It gives us structure. I looked around the apartment. The folders, the notes, the copied forms, the screenshots turning my life into a case file. For the first time since Sunday dinner, the truth no longer felt scattered. It had edges now, and edges could be traced. The next morning, I was back in Marcus's office with the original authorization form sealed in a plastic sleeve, fresh printouts from the lender records, and coffee I had already let go cold. I had barely slept, but the panic from 2 nights earlier had changed shape. It was still there, but now it had somewhere to go. Marcus reviewed the new documents in silence for a few minutes. He compared the signature sample to the copied loan applications, then moved to the Audi records and the Dayton address. When he was done, he set his pen down and looked at me. This gives us enough to take the next step, he said. I waited. I think you give them one chance to respond through counsel before we file. I must have looked surprised, because he added, not as a courtesy, as a line in the sand. That made more sense. He explained it simply. If my parents chose to tell the truth, preserve records, and stop trying to manage me emotionally, that would matter later. If they stalled, pressured me, involved relatives, or tried to shift blame, that would matter too. The point wasn't to help them. It was to see what they did once they knew the situation had moved out of the kitchen and into something formal. 7 days, he said. Why 7? Because it's enough time to answer, if they intend to answer. He drafted the message while I watched. It was short, controlled, and stripped of anything emotional. It said I had discovered fraudulent accounts opened in my name, that I had retained legal counsel, and that my parents had 7 days to come forward and cooperate through my attorney in resolving the matter. If they refused or ignored the deadline, we would move ahead with formal reporting. When he slid the draft toward me, I read it twice. Seeing my life reduced to language, that plain did something strange to me. No Sunday dinner. No crying. No old injuries dressed up as love. Just facts, legal counsel, and a deadline. You want this sent to both of them? I asked. To your father, Marcus said. He'll make sure your mother sees it. He was right. In my family, dangerous information traveled fastest. At 11:58, Sitting across from my attorney with the courthouse visible through the conference room window, I sent the message. Then I turned my phone face down on the table. My father saw it a few minutes later. He didn't reply. That silence stretched through the rest of the afternoon. I drove back to Cincinnati with the radio off and my phone on the passenger seat, checking it more often than I wanted to admit. By early evening, there was still nothing from him. No denial, no outrage. No demand that I come home and talk this out. My mother texted first. "Please don't do this to your father. He hasn't slept." I looked at the message and locked my screen. Not, "What are you talking about?" Not, "There's been some mistake." Just don't do this to your father. About an hour later, Lila texted too. Her message was long enough that I had to scroll to finish it. She said she had no idea what Mom and Dad had done. She said it was unfair to drag her into something she didn't create. She said she loved me. She said I was hurting the wrong people. I read it twice. What struck me wasn't just what she said. It was what she didn't say. She never asked what I had found. She never sounded confused. She never asked why there might be a car in Dayton, or an insurance policy under my name, or accounts attached to a P.O. box in Lexington. She went straight to hurt, straight to guilt, straight to the part where I was supposed to soften. I set the phone down and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the parking lot still held a sheen from earlier rain. Someone in the next building was unloading groceries. A dog barked once somewhere across the lot, then went quiet. Everything around me looked normal, and that felt wrong. At 8:17, my father finally called. I let it ring until it stopped. A second later, a voicemail alert came through. I played it on speaker. His voice was calm in that way, that always meant he was angry enough to be careful. "You need to think very carefully about what you're doing," he said. "Once this starts, there's no taking it back. You bring lawyers and police into this family, and you won't just embarrass us. You'll hurt everyone attached to this." He paused. Then he added, "You still have time to handle this privately." The message ended there. No apology, no confusion, no denial, just pressure. I forwarded the voicemail to Marcus, added screenshots of my mother's text and Lila's message, and saved all three into the evidence folder. Then I opened the timeline and added a new line. Day 1 of 7. Pressure, no truth. I stared at the screen for a long moment after that. They were not spending those 7 days deciding whether to come clean. They were spending them deciding which version of the story might still work. By Thursday morning, I knew exactly which version my father had chosen. I was halfway through a vendor compliance review at my desk when my phone lit up with a call from Aunt Marianne. I almost let it go to voicemail. Marianne never called during business hours unless someone was in the hospital, at a funeral, or preparing to be offended on someone else's behalf. I glanced down the hallway before answering and stepped away from my desk. "Naomi," she said, already tight with disapproval. "What is going on with you? Not are you okay? Not I heard something happened. Just the assumption that I had become the problem." I stopped near the copy room and kept my voice low. "What did Dad tell you?" "That Lila is in financial trouble, and instead of helping, you've hired a lawyer to threaten your own parents." Her tone sharpened. "I honestly don't understand how you could do that." There it was. Clean. Simple. Portable. My father had already found the version of the story that traveled well. Marcus had warned me not to start arguing my case to relatives just because they demanded access to it. Once evidence left my hands in pieces, it stopped being evidence and became family gossip with attachments. So I chose my words carefully. "There's more to it than that," I said. "I can't get into details right now, but what he told you is not the whole story." "Then explain it." I looked through the glass into the conference room across the hall. 2 coworkers were bent over a spreadsheet, talking quietly, their day moving on like nothing in the world had shifted. The contrast was so sharp it almost made me dizzy. "I'm not discussing it like this," I said. Marianne gave a short, irritated breath. "Sometimes people just need help, Naomi. Sometimes you keep things in the family, and do the decent thing. I felt my grip tighten on the phone. That was always the language, wasn't it? Keep it in the family, handle it privately, don't make things worse. In families like mine, silence was treated like maturity. I am handling it, I said. No, she snapped, you're humiliating your parents. I could have told her about the Audi, the insurance policy, the forged applications, my mother's admission. I could have read every number out loud and let the dollar amounts do the talking. But that would have turned me into just one more person, flinging pieces of the story around. So I said, I need you to trust that I have reasons. Her answer came cold and fast. I trust your father. Then she hung up. I stood there for a second staring at my screen. No curiosity. No pause. No question about why I might have hired counsel in the first place. My father had not gone looking for understanding. He had gone looking for loyalty. By lunch, whatever version of events he wanted in circulation was already moving faster than I could stop it. The group text appeared a few minutes later. There were 14 people in it. Dad, Mom, Lila, Marianne, Uncle Rob, Denise, 2 cousins. A few family members I only saw at holidays and funerals. The opening message came from my father. Our family is going through a difficult time. Naomi has chosen to involve lawyers instead of working with us privately. Please encourage peace and wisdom before this gets worse. I stared at it. Then the replies started. Family should stay family. Don't let outsiders turn this ugly. You only get one mother and father. Whatever happened, she's still your sister. Money isn't worth losing family over. Not one person asked what had actually happened. Not one person asked why I had hired a lawyer. Not one person asked what working with us privately was supposed to mean. My father had handed them a version of me they were already prepared to believe. The capable daughter, the one with money, the one who had gone away, become hard, and started thinking she was better than everyone else. It fit too neatly inside old family habits to require proof. I screenshotted every message as it came in. That part didn't even feel emotional anymore. It felt procedural. 20 minutes later, Lila sent one message into the thread. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted my sister back. I read that twice. It was dishonest in exactly the way I should have expected from her. She didn't want me back. She wanted me unsure of myself, guilty enough to stop asking questions. Willing to step back into the version of family where feelings overruled facts and whoever sounded hurt first got to seem innocent. I muted the thread and went back to work. For the rest of the afternoon, I answered emails, reviewed documents, and sat through meetings while my family quietly built a version of me that would make my father easier to defend. Every hour or so, I checked the thread long enough to preserve the new messages, then set it down again. By the time I got home that night, I had 53 screenshots saved in a folder labeled Family Pressure. Then I opened the timeline and added one more line beneath day 1 of 7. Pressure. No truth. Day 2 of 7. Father starts building cover through the family. By Saturday morning, I understood something I had spent most of my life avoiding. Pressure did not make my family more honest. It made them more strategic. I had spent Friday night saving screenshots from the group text, backing up voicemails, and organizing everything into folders Marcus could actually use. By the time I went to bed, my apartment was quiet, my phone was on silent, and my body felt like it had been bracing for impact so long, it no longer knew how to stand any other way. At 9:12 the next morning, someone knocked on my door. Not loudly, just 3 measured taps. I was still in socks, halfway through making coffee, when I looked through the peephole and saw my mother standing in the hallway with a glass baking dish in her arms, covered in foil. For one disorienting second, she looked exactly like herself. Not Donna Carter, the woman who had admitted signing my name on the phone, just my mother. Hair brushed, cardigan buttoned, face pale from the drive, holding food like she had shown up to smooth over something ordinary. That had always been her way. When words failed, she arrived with casserole. When conflict sharpened, she softened it with food, tears, and the suggestion that everyone was just doing their best. I opened the door, but I didn't move aside. "I made chicken divan," she said, lifting the dish slightly. "Can we talk?" Her eyes were swollen. Maybe from crying. Maybe from the drive. I no longer trusted myself to tell the difference. "We can talk here," I said. She glanced past my shoulder, toward the apartment. "Naomi, please?" "No." The hallway went still. She shifted the dish to her other arm. "I came all this way." I kept one hand on the door. "Did you sign my name?" Her mouth twitched. She blinked, looked down at the dish, then back at me. "Your father." "No," I said. "Not Dad. You. Did you sign my name?" The elevator hummed somewhere down the hall. A door shut on another floor. My mother stood there with food cooling in her hands, and I could see the old plan failing in real time. She had come expecting me to take the dish, let her in, sit down at the table, and slowly be pulled away from the facts. When she answered, her voice was so thin I almost missed it. "Yes." The word itself was plain, almost flat. Then she rushed to cover it. "But everything was falling apart," she said. "Lila was in trouble. The store was behind. Your father kept saying it would only be temporary. You signed my name." Tears filled her eyes again. "I was trying to hold this family together." I looked at her for a long second. That part, at least, was familiar. No one in my family ever admitted doing harm without explaining why the harm had been necessary. There was always a reason, a crisis, a bigger good, something that was supposed to make the damage feel smaller if you looked at it from the right angle. I glanced down at the dish in her hands. Steam no longer fogged the glass. "Go home, Mom." She stared at me as if she genuinely didn't understand the sentence. "Naomi, go home," I said again. "And tell Dad he has 5 days left." That changed her face, more than anything else had. For a second, I thought she might finally say something clear, something useful, something that didn't hide behind family language. But all she managed was, "If you do this, there won't be a family left." I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "That wasn't my choice." Her chin trembled. She stood there another moment, still holding the dish, still waiting for the version of me who would cave because she was standing there with food and tears and history. She didn't get her. Finally, she turned and walked toward the elevator. She never looked back. The casserole went with her. I closed the door and stood there for a few seconds with my hand still on the knob, listening to the building settle around me. A pipe clicked in the wall. My coffee machine hissed in the kitchen. Somewhere above me, someone dragged furniture across the floor. I wanted to cry. Instead, I went back to the table, opened my laptop, and added a new line to the timeline. Day 3 of 7. Mother admitted in person that she signed my name. Then I typed a clean summary of the conversation and sent it to Marcus while it was still fresh. A few minutes later, before I had even closed the file, my phone buzzed with a message from my father. "You need to stop punishing your mother for trying to save this family." I looked at the screen for a long moment. Then I took a screenshot, saved it to the folder, and added one more note under the entry from that morning. "Father frames forgery as protection." He sent that text on a Saturday morning. By Tuesday, the 7 days were over. Marcus met me in his office just before noon with every document already prepared in separate stacks. Identity theft report, fraud dispute packets, credit bureau filings, account summaries, timeline, screenshots, voicemail transcripts, and my written summary of both calls with my parents. He had arranged them with the same calm order he brought to everything, but I could feel the weight of what they meant before I sat down. "This is the point where it stops being a family argument," he said. I looked at the papers in front of me. In some ways, it had stopped being a family argument the night my father demanded I pay a debt he already knew was living under my name. But this was different. This was the point where the consequences would begin moving without anyone's permission. Without tears. Without casseroles. without group texts about peace and prayer. I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. I signed the identity theft affidavit first. Then the formal disputes. Then the authorizations Marcus needed to contact the lenders and credit bureaus directly. One by one, I signed my own name on documents meant to give it back to me. When I finished, Marcus stacked the pages neatly, capped his pen, and said, "All right, that was it. No ceremony, no speech, just 2 words and a table full of consequences." By 4:30 that afternoon, I heard the first engine outside my building, then a second, then a third. I walked to the window and looked down into the parking lot. My father's truck, my mother's sedan, Lila's black Audi, and behind them, my Aunt Marianne's SUV. They had come together. Of course they had. I didn't wait for the knock this time. I opened the door before any of them could perform surprise. My father stood in front, jaw tight, Sunday jacket over a work shirt, as if dressing respectably could still control the terms of what was happening. My mother stood half a step behind him, one hand wrapped around the strap of her purse. Lila looked pale, furious, and scared all at once. Marianne stood to the side with the stiff posture of someone who had driven 2 hours expecting to fix a family problem and had just realized she might not understand it. "We need to settle this now," my father said. I opened the door wider. "You're too late." Marcus stepped into the doorway beside me before my father could answer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "My client has already filed." The silence that followed was absolute. Not shock exactly, more like collapse. My mother's face changed first, then Lila's. Marianne looked from me to Marcus to the Audi in the parking lot below, and I watched understanding begin to move across her face too slowly to help anyone. My father recovered first, because men like him always do. "You're destroying this family," he said. "No," I replied. "You destroyed it when you decided my name was something you could use." For the first time since Sunday dinner, he had nothing ready. Behind him, Lila started crying. My mother closed her eyes. Marianne said my name once, softly, like she was finally hearing it correctly. I looked at all of them, my family, the people who had spent 7 days choosing pressure over truth, and felt something colder than anger settle in my chest. "I'm not paying for what you did," I said. "Not with my money. Not with my future. Not with my name." Then I stepped back, and Marcus closed the door.